Hi, fifth grade. I want to go over the questions from the circuit chapter that I read last week, which was Miracle in Tent City. We had finished the chapter and I asked you to look over the questions and write your answers to them. So you can get that packet out and we can go over the answers. So for number 5, what bargain do Mama and Papa make with El Santo Niño de Atocha? They made a deal saying that if Torito got better, they would pray for a year to El Santo Niño. And so they did. The family prayed for a year every night using the Santo Niño holy card that they had. And they prayed for Torito to get better. And the deal worked. So because of their prayer, Torito got better. Number 6, in Francisco's dream, where do the butterflies take him and whom does he find there? The butterflies take him to an alfalfa field. It's a plant. And Torito is sitting there. And then when Mama hears about Francisco's dream, what does she do? She makes a cloak for Torito to wear. And he wears it basically for a whole year. And it's a blue cloak just like the Santo Niño de Atocha was wearing in the holy card. And she believed that that was the right thing to do. And he wore it for a year, except when it needed to be washed. And a year later, he was all better. And whom does Mama credit for curing Torito? She credits God and their prayers. So she was a very faithful person, faith-filled. All right, I'm going to read the next chapter. And this is called El Ángel de Oro, Angel of Gold. And it is, the little dedication is for Miguel Antonio. You'll find out who Miguel is here. It always rained a lot in Corcoran during the cotton season, but that year it rained more than usual. No sooner had we arrived from Fowler, where we had picked grapes, than it started to pour. Our cabin was one of several farm workers' shacks lined up in a row, behind which ran a small creek. There was not a lot to do when it rained. We stayed indoors telling ghost stories we had heard from other migrant workers. We also played guessing games. When I got tired of listening to the same stories told many times before, I watched our neighbor's goldfish. From our window, I could see into the next cabin, where a fishbowl sat on a small table. I spent hours glued to our window watching the goldfish glide in slow motion, stirring the jade-green plants with its delicate fins. Mama enjoyed watching it too. She called it El Ángel de Oro. That's where the chapter title comes from. Papa passed most of his time worrying. He smoked one cigarette after another and complained about the rain because we could not pick the cotton when it was wet. If this rain doesn't stop, we'll have to leave and find work somewhere else, he repeated, pacing up and down the floor. Even the thought of rain gave him a headache. Luckily for me, I got to go to school the following week. Monday morning, after getting Mama's blessing, I headed for school, which was only about a mile from the cotton labor camp. I could see it from where we lived. On the way, I met Miguelito, who lived in the same labor camp. He was 2 years older than I and had started school for the first time that year, a month earlier, in October. Okay, so now it's November, and this is the first time Panchito has been to school this school year. So it's not like our school year for him. He cannot start earlier because he's out in the fields picking crops. He took me to the main office and translated into Spanish some of the questions the principal asked me. Before I was led to my 3rd grade class, Miguelito and I agreed to meet on the playground after school and walk home together. Miguelito was already waiting for me when I got to the playground. We started walking toward the labor camp, following the same route we had taken that morning. The path was muddy and full of puddles, just like the school playground. Miguelito and I imagined the puddles were lakes, and we pretended to be giants stepping over them. We counted out loud the number of lakes we stepped over, trying to outdo each other. Miguelito had longer legs than I did, but I kept up with him until I slipped and lost my balance. My right foot landed right in front of one of the puddles. My right foot landed right in one of the puddles, splashing muddy water on my clean overalls and on Miguelito. The cardboard inside my shoe got soggy and started to fall apart. Once I collected myself, Miguelito and I began laughing. We continued walking, but every time we looked at each other, we would start laughing again. This went on until we arrived at the labor camp. As we approached our cabin, I knew no one was home because our carcachita, our old jalopy, that's that rundown old car that they drive, was not parked in front. Want to come in? I asked. I have to go home first, he answered. I'll come back in a little while. I'll be in the back by the creek, I said. Don't forget, our cabin is number 10. I live 10 cabins down from you, number 20, Miguelito replied cheerfully. I went inside our cabin. It was cold and quiet. I went over to our window to look at our neighbor's goldfish. I watched it swim back and forth. I wonder if he gets lonely, I thought to myself. I then went out behind our cabin and sat on a rock by the edge of the creek. I listened to the water murmur and watched the little gray fish play with each other. The current gently tugged at the plants growing in the water. I picked up some pebbles and tossed them in one at a time, trying not to hit the fish. What are you doing? Asked Miguelito, coming up behind me and making me jump. I'm just watching the little fish while I wait for my parents to get back from work. Do you want to catch some? Catch what? I asked. Fish, tonto, he replied, chuckling. Before I could answer, he jumped up like a grasshopper, ran over to a small pepper tree that was a few yards away, and yanked off 2 branches. These are our fishing poles, he said excitedly, handing one over to me. Tomorrow I'll bring the other stuff and we'll finish making them. That night it poured again, and in the morning the rain turned to drizzle. I put my hat on and walked out the door, hoping to meet Miguelito so we could walk to school together. I could not wait to catch fish with him in the afternoon, but he did not show up, and I did not see him at school all day. When I returned home from school that afternoon, I went to see if he was waiting for me by the creek. He was not there either. Then I remembered his cabin number. I hurried to number 20 and knocked on the door. No one answered. I went around to the side of the cabin and peeked through the window. The cabin was completely empty. My heart sank into my stomach. Slowly I walked home, feeling a lump in my throat. I heard Miguelito's laugh in my head and thought about our game with the puddles. When I got home, I stood by our window and stared at our neighbor's goldfish for the longest time. Finally, my family arrived. They had spent all day driving around looking for work. It rained so much that night that the creek flooded into the dirt streets, making the cabins look like they floated on a lake. Then days later, when the clouds disappeared and the sun emerged, the lake began to split into hundreds of small puddles throughout the labor camp. One day on my way home from school, I discovered little gray fish in the puddles. I had no idea how they got there, but I noticed that in the smaller puddles, the fish were dying. The mud was suffocating them. As I gazed at the dead fish, the image of the goldfish flashed in my mind. I quickly ran to our cabin and got the empty Hills Brothers coffee can. I filled it with water and began picking up the dying fish from the mud puddles, putting them in the can, and dumping them in the creek. After a couple of hours, I was exhausted. There were too many, and I could not work fast enough to save them all. I prayed for rain, but the sun kept beating down, turning the puddles into mud. I picked up one last small dying fish and took it to our next-door neighbor, who owned the goldfish. I knocked and knocked on the door until my hand hurt. No one was home. I placed the coffee can on the front steps and peered inside. The little gray fish looked up at me, rapidly opening and closing its mouth. That evening, I looked through the window into our neighbor's cabin. The goldfish swam peacefully alongside the little gray fish. I sighed and smiled to myself. The next morning, I took the fishing rod Miguelito had given me, placed it gently in the creek, and watched it float away. So in this chapter then with Miguelito, it's a very short chapter, but it has some information that I'd like to highlight for you. Miguelito, although he was 2 years older than Francisco, they seemed to get along pretty well, and they had fun with the puddles and the fishing and whatever. But when Francisco didn't see Miguelito at school and he went to his cabin to find out where he was so disappointed to find that he had moved. Yet again, another friend that he probably wouldn't run into again. Maybe he would see him later on, but remember Curtis from the first grade, that was the only time he had him in his class, and he never saw him again. So Francisco's sad because, here it is. He made a good friend and had fun playing with him, and then he moved away. And there was one other thing I wanted to talk about when it says that he couldn't save all the fish and he prayed for rain. I wonder what his father would think if he found out that Panchito was praying for rain, and the dad was already worried because it was raining so much and they couldn't pick the cotton and they were going to have to move somewhere else to find other work. So if he found out his son was praying for rain, I don't think he'd be too happy. That is all for this chapter. But I want to review the next chapter, and I say review because I actually read this story to you as a regular picture book in the 4th grade. It's called Christmas Gift. And just to recap what it's all about, I'm not going to read the chapter from this book, The Circuit, because we've already heard it as a storybook. But just as a review, It was about when they were in Corcoran at a cotton labor camp. They had to move from there, and because it was so, there wasn't a lot of work, and they needed to move. And so anyway, they they were getting ready to get their stuff together, and they were packing up, and this young couple came to the door, and the dad invited them in, and it turned out that they were trying to sell some of the things that they had, because they didn't have any money either, and the wife was pregnant. It was right around Christmas time, and the dad said, "I'm sorry, but we're broke too." And that statement just threw Francisco, because he was like, wait a minute, we're broke? I thought it was going to be better than last year when we couldn't afford to get any presents. And so he thought, it can't be as bad as that. But one of the things that the man was trying to sell was a wallet. And another thing that he tried to sell was a little handkerchief that his wife had done some needlework on, embroidery. And the dad said, and that was only 10 cents. But the dad said, no, I'm sorry, but we're broke. So they left. And then they moved to a new place. They loaded up the carcachita, and they got to their new place. And when Christmas got closer, the mom wrapped some of the presents that she had for them. He tried to peek underneath the covers to see what she was doing at night, but she was hidden by the crates that they used for their tables. So Mama was wrapping the presents, and the next morning, he and his brothers all got up to see what they had gotten. And he opened it up, and it was a bag of candy. And what he really wanted was a bouncy ball. He was really disappointed at first. He was like, oh, I guess we really were broke. I didn't get the ball that I wanted. I got a bag of candy. And then he saw that his mom was kind of crying. And the dad reached underneath the mattress and pulled out the little handkerchief that he had actually bought from that young couple for 10 cents. And he told her, Feliz Navidad. At the end of this chapter, Panchito also sees that, this was really hard for his parents to not be able to give their children what they wanted. And in the story that I read to you, it does say that he offered his parents a piece of candy, and he wished them a happy Christmas or Merry Christmas. Anyway, just a very difficult time. I'm sure parents, when they can't quite get what their children want because of money situations, they feel bad. And these parents felt very bad because they could hardly get their children anything because they were so very poor. So that's the recap of Christmas Gift. And that is all for today.